All right. Hi, Audrey.
Hello.
Hi.
Sorry about the connection issues.
No worries, no worries. Hope does have its complexities. How are things going?
They're wonderful. I'm so excited to be presenting today.
Likewise, likewise. So, everybody from the audience has joined in, and again, audience, this is Audrey from the Good Food Institute. She'll be presenting a little bit more about her insights into the alternatives food space and specifically about proteins as well. So, Audrey, I'll be leaving it to you.
So, I'm so excited to be here. Today I'll be providing a brief masterclass on the alternative protein industry. We'll kick things off with an introduction to the Good Food Institute, where I'm a startup innovation specialist. I'll review why alternative proteins are so critical for a sustainable food system. We'll also dive into the alternative protein production landscape and review the huge market opportunities we see for the industry. My talk will be about 25 minutes long, and I'm hoping to leave about 5 minutes of Q&A at the end of the session. And by the close of today, I hope you'll walk away excited about the promise of alternative proteins and have a greater understanding of the current state of the industry. So first things first, let me introduce the Good Food Institute. GFI is a global nonprofit 501c3 that is dedicated to accelerating the shift to a sustainable, healthy, and just food system. We're funded entirely by philanthropy, not industry. Our organization employs over 100 staff around the globe with 3 key programmatic departments. In science and technology, our team of PhD scientists work to advance and open source the foundational science of alternative proteins. Our corporate engagement team, the team that I work on, builds relationships with the world's largest food manufacturers, meat companies, restaurants, and retailers to help them capitalize on opportunities in the space. And we also provide support to industry entrepreneurs and startups, as well as to investors and financial institutions. Our policy team advocates for fair regulation of plant-based and cultivated meat and lobbies for government investment in sustainable protein R&D. And I do want to stress that GFI plays a unique role in the alt protein ecosystem. We share knowledge freely, our research data and insights are open access, and support the progress of every innovator in the space. We focus on the white spaces, and we take a big picture perspective. GFI works across sectors, industries, and international borders, as well as into future decades. We spot and address today's industry-wide challenges, and we forecast and avert obstacles. And so, to begin with today, I just want to take a minute to ground us in the universe in which we're operating. The slide you see here is a visual representation of total meat, a concept we think about a lot at GFI. The global meat industry produces about 350 million metric tons of meat annually. And for some context, that's the weight equivalent of producing 1 million VW Beetles worth of meat every single day. Annual total meat is expected to grow to about 500 million metric tons by 2050. And as you can see here, alternative proteins is barely a rounding error of this market right now. However, the conventional meat production system also produces a lot of meat, but it also imposes pretty significant externalities on our planet, and these negative impacts will only get worse as animal protein consumption increases globally. And that's really the key question that we're working to address here. How will we feed 10 billion people by 2050, and how will we do so sustainably, efficiently, and safely? Industrial animal agriculture is the top 2 to 3 most significant contributors to the world's most pressing environmental issues. It uses 75% of agricultural land, yet it provides only 33% of the global protein supply. Plus, using animals for protein is just inherently inefficient. For example, chickens are the most efficient animal at converting calories in to calories out. However, it requires 9 calories of input to produce just 1 calorie that humans can eat. And industrial animal agriculture is the #1 user of medically important antibiotics. So GFI has a little bit of a different approach than what we've used in the past, which is asking people to reduce their meat consumption, which frankly has not worked. Instead of asking people to give up the meat, egg, and dairy products they love, we believe the answer to these many issues is to make these products in a more sustainable and efficient way. We now have the technology to produce meat without needing to rely on animals. And so in the next few slides, I want to take a few minutes to look at the three main production systems for alternative proteins, how they work, and the competitive landscape for each. So as you can see here, we see alternative proteins as fitting into three categories from a production, cost, and infrastructure perspective. One, we can make proteins directly from plants. We can use fermentation technology or use animal cell cultures. Plant-based meat, as we use the term, is in essence products that are biomimicking meat using plants as the building blocks. They look, taste, and cook just like conventional meat. These are not the veggie burgers of 2 decades ago. These are burgers that look and taste exactly like meat. And then there's fermentation, which is a developing category and increasingly being used as an enabling technology for the industry. It allows for the production of standalone protein sources or functional ingredients. And the third segment of alternative proteins is cultivated meat, which is often referred to as cultured meat or cell-based meat. GFI, we tend to use the term cultivated. It is identical to animal meat at the cellular level. It provides the same sensory nutritional profile as conventionally produced meat. I also just want to take a minute to note that this is not imitation meat. This is not synthetic meat. This is actual animal meat grown outside of an animal. And at scale, it will not be produced in a lab, so calling it lab-grown meat also isn't accurate. It will be produced in cultivators, kind of like a beer brewery. So let's take a look at this first category. And this is one that you might all be familiar with already, which is plant-based. Excuse me. While plant-based products have been around for decades, it was only recently that innovative technologies have been developed enabling us to biomimic the sensory experience of eating meat using plants. And the brainstorm behind plant-based meat, egg, and dairy essentially is that plants and animals are largely made up of the same biochemical compounds. For every protein, lipid, or functional compound in the dozen or so animal species that we eat, we can find an analog or replacement among the hundreds of thousands of species in the plant kingdom. And if a replacement doesn't exist in nature, we can make it through mechanical, chemical, or biological technology applications. Plant-based proteins are the most developed category. As you can see here, there are hundreds of brands and products on the market today, and this is a non-exhaustive list of what's out there. Startups are able to innovate more rapidly and pursue more niche or riskier strategies than large corporations, and are thus the first innovation in nearly all the categories that we're seeing. However, it's important to note that as more interest and investment flows into the sector, we're really seeing the competitive landscape expand. It's not just young startups getting involved. Major food and beverage companies are jumping into the fray. This is a massive shift that will boost sales growth as these companies leverage their strength in distribution, manufacturing, and marketing. This brings me to our second pillar, which is cultivated meat. This is genuine animal meat or seafood that can replicate the sensory and nutritional profile. It's composed of the same exact cell types as meat, as animal meat, and it's arranged in the same three-dimensional structure as animal muscle tissue. Although there is a tremendous amount of momentum behind the industry, it is still less than 10 years old and has a ways to go in terms of scaling up, which will require significant financing, capacity building, regulatory approvals, and technical optimization. However, GFI has done quite a bit of analysis that shows that cultivated meat is indeed feasible and will reach the market without the need for any new moonshot scientific breakthroughs. And as with any industrial biotechnology, cultivated meat must progress from bench scale and research and development labs to pilot scale to commercial scale production. In 2020, a huge and exciting new development came about when Singapore became the first country in the world to approve the sale of cultivated meat. The company Eat Just then began selling their cultivated chicken nugget product in limited quantities in Singapore. We anticipate seeing many more pilot scale product launches in the coming years, likely starting in food service channels. This graphic here provides a condensed industry timeline with some of GFI's more conservative predictions for the future. We do project that it's likely that in the next decade, commercial scale cultivated meat production will be a reality, and consulting firm McKinsey shares this view, predicting that by 2030, cultivated meat will be cost competitive with conventional animal production systems. Although there are many factors that could speed up this timeline, like building out business to business, cultivated meat companies, getting more involvement from life science companies, in addition to gaining government, financial support, and regulatory support. And since the first cultivated meat companies formed in 2015, the competitive landscape has grown with increasing speed, nearly doubling in number of established startups every year. The commercial landscape now comprises more than 70 startups focused on cultivated meat, and another 40 or so life science companies have publicly announced a formal initiative or business line to supply cultivated meat startups with critical inputs to meet manufacturing and infrastructure needs. What's also very cool is that companies at the leading edge are now manufacturing cultivated meat at pilot scale, which is a crucial early step to assess the viability of industrial scale production. And now onto the third production pillar we'll be discussing, which is fermentation, and the pillar that I'm probably the most excited about. GFI defines fermentation as the use of single-cell fungi, mycelium, bacteria, microalgae, and other microbes as a bioproduction platform to modify or produce proteins, fats, or other functional ingredients. I think it's important to note that fermentation is not a new technology, but it's being used in new and novel ways to drive plant-based product innovation. It's being used to create both ingredients and standalone plant-based meat products. And it can really be used within the alternative protein industry, that is, in three primary ways, which I'll dive into over the next few slides. The first is traditional fermentation. This is probably what you are most immediately familiar with. And this uses intact live microorganisms to modulate and process plant-derived ingredients. It produces unique flavor and nutritional profiles and a modified texture. Examples of this that you're probably familiar with include fermenting soybeans into tempeh, using lactic acid bacteria to produce dairy. This is also the process used to make things like sauerkraut or kimchi. Yoko's Creamery, that you see on this slide, makes plant-based cheese and other dairy products using traditional dairy fermentation techniques on plant-based ingredients. The second pillar of fermentation is biomass fermentation. And this leverages microorganism fast growth and high protein content to produce large protein quantities. The biomass can either serve as an ingredient or the food product itself. And a familiar example that you might have seen is the meatless brand Corn, which is made from mycoprotein, as this has been on the market for several decades. And last, here we have precision fermentation. And this uses microbial hosts as cell factories to produce specific functional ingredients that often require greater purity. And these ingredients enable improved sensory characteristics and functional attributes. Examples of this include Perfect Day Foods, which is producing whey and casein protein, traditionally from cows, and Clara Foods, which is producing egg proteins. We're using precision fermentation in new ways for alternative proteins, but it's not a new technique. In fact, 90% of modern dairy cheese production today uses fermentation-derived rennet enzymes rather than extracts from calf stomachs, which is where rennet was traditionally sourced from. So now that we've covered the different types of fermentation technology, let's look at the industry landscape and the companies involved. The most remarkable thing is how much this competitive landscape is young and how rapidly growing it is. And it expanded substantially in 2020. 13 startups dedicated to the use of fermentation launched, along with new suppliers focused on fermentation-enabled alternative protein ingredients. A whopping 51 known companies are now dedicated to fermentation for alternative proteins, an increase of 16% from 2019, and more than 30 others have a business line in alternative protein fermentation. 4 in 5 of these companies formed since 2015, with a median founding year of 2018. So, taking a step back, so far we've gone over the 3 main production platforms for alternative proteins. However, I do want to take a moment to stress and to note that ultimately we predict in the future we won't see these 3 alternative protein production platforms as these distinct industry segments. We'll rather view them as one large industry where we produce animal product alternatives across an entire spectrum, utilizing ingredients from one or more technology. An example that you might be familiar with today is the Impossible Burger, which is plant-based but uses fermentation to produce hemoglobin, the signature ingredient that gives it that bloody appearance and meaty taste. We also expect to see blended products with, for example, cultivated meat fat and plant-based protein hit the market at some point in the future. And these hybrided products will most likely offer better sensory experience for consumers. So now that we've taken a look at the production platforms and types of alternative proteins, let's take a minute to dive into the market opportunities. There's a lot of exciting things to see here. The most important thing I want to start us off with is that with this next generation of plant-based meat, companies are no longer just targeting the small niche of vegans and vegetarians, which at least in the United States make up only 6% of the population. Instead, they're looking at both omnivores and flexitarians, which is clearly a much larger market. And in fact, according to the NPD group, 89% of the consumers who regularly eat plant-based foods do not consider themselves vegan or vegetarian. And here, looking at plant-based meat data specifically, in this case, it's from Nielsen. Omnivores are driving plant-based meat purchasing. Nielsen found that 98% of plant-based meat buyers also buy animal meat. You can see the opportunity when you look at it the other way as well. 21% of animal meat buyers currently purchase plant-based meat. This also means there's room for significant growth in the category. And this trend is seen across multiple studies. 95% of people who order the Impossible Burger regularly consume animal products, and 93% of people buying Beyond Meat in grocery stores are also putting animal-based meat in their basket. Right here, you can see that the US plant-based market has grown significantly and rapidly. In fact, from 2019 to 2020, it increased by 45% to $1.4 billion. And the growth is not just in the United States. Here you can see how plant-based sales increased 28% in Europe. And the momentum continues to be pretty strong. This study by UBS found, amazingly, that the percentage of consumers who have tried plant-based meat increased nearly 4 times, from 13% to 48% over the past year. You know, we've been calling 2019 the year plant-based meat went mainstream, which I think is really evident here. And throughout COVID, plant-based meat has performed very well. Here's looking at just refrigerated plant-based meat, which grew 121% over that period, well exceeding the growth we also saw in animal-based meat with a shift towards at-home consumption. And this slide here is just to give you a sense of the market opportunity available. Right now, plant-based milk comprises 15% of the overall milk category, and this share has been growing year over year. If plant-based meat achieved the same market penetration as plant-based milk, it would be a $14 billion opportunity. And there's still a great deal of untapped potential in the market. According to this Bank of America study, almost 40% of consumers haven't yet tried plant-based meat but are open to purchasing it. But only 30% of consumers say that plant-based meat tastes as good or better than animal-based meat. That perception has increased meaningfully, likely driven by a lot of taste-focused innovation in the category, but there's still a ways to go. And when they asked other consumers who were interested in purchasing what would make them, they responded with first, improved taste, and second, lower price. So we really see that innovations in taste and the ability to lower price are what will make the plant-based products of the future most competitive. We've been talking a lot about plant-based meat because that's what's available on the market today. However, I did want to touch briefly on market acceptance of cultivated meat. Here you can see that half of US consumers are willing to eat cultivated meat regularly. A separate study found that half of US consumers are willing to buy cultivated meat regularly. And 30% of US consumers are very or extremely likely to purchase cultivated meat. And zooming out a little bit, the global alternative protein market is projected to grow significantly. Here we've aggregated various analyst projections on the plant-based meat market 10 to 15 years out. You can see a pretty broad range of estimates here, but the consensus seems to be that plant-based meat will have about a 10% share of the total meat market, valued between 34 and 41 billion in the United States. And I just wanted to note that these projections are only for plant-based meat. When you add in cultivated meat, the percent of the meat share that alternative proteins are predicted to capture in the next 10 to 20 years increases significantly. So now that we've seen the huge market opportunities available with alternative proteins, let's take a quick look at some of the investment trends and opportunities. Investments in alternative proteins have been rising steadily year over year. Last year, $3.1 billion in capital was invested across plant-based, fermentation, and cultivated meat companies. This is an impressive sum, but it's also important to note that the industry is still very, very young from an investment standpoint. And this presents a pretty ample opportunity for VC investors, entrepreneurs, and strategic partners to get involved at the early stages and capitalize on this global shift in meat production. And here you can see an additional breakdown of the investments in plant-based fermentation and the cultivated meat pillars. Plant-based investments lead the way. This isn't surprising, it's the most established of the production platforms. However, you'll see that investment in fermentation technology skyrocketed last year in 2020. Fermentation companies raised $587 million, a greater than twofold increase from 2019 that represents 15% of all-time sector funding. Plus, investment in the nascent field of cultivated meat topped $350 million in 2020, nearly double the previous cumulative investment in the industry. 2020 saw the industry's first Series B funding rounds, as well as the first substantial public sector R&D funding in both the United States and the European Union. Within the alternative protein sector, cultivated meat accounted for 14% of overall annual private sector investments. And then before we wrap up today, I did just want to share a few concluding thoughts about the promise and opportunities inherent in liberating the production of meat from animals. As you may have noticed during this presentation, myself and GFI are very long-term optimistic about the future of alternative proteins and their ability to feed a growing population sustainably, efficiently, and safely. Ultimately, these new products are a function of assembly as compared to the disassembly of animal bodies. And with this assembly process, we really have brand new, complete creative control about how to build alternative protein products from the ground up. And we can be innovative in entirely new ways, many of which I'm sure we haven't even thought of yet. You can imagine having brand logos printed directly onto meat, custom meat blends made from various animal species that have been developed for the maximum flavor. Or we could develop healthier, better for you products that have been developed to include maybe healthier fat ratios, different types of fats, or other various biofortifications, not to mention other products that have improved food safety and shelf lives. Alternative proteins also offer significant control over what you are able to produce. Right now, we make huge amounts of lower value meat that is not quite as desirable. However, with the specificity of alternative protein production platforms, you could envision our consumption patterns changing significantly. This is because we'd be able to make the highest value, most delicious cuts of meat at the same price point as low value meats. For example, Wagyu beef or bluefin tuna, which are incredibly expensive and much rarer now, could potentially be the same price point as ground beef in the future, something that I know I would be very much looking forward to. Alternative proteins also offer the promise of food security and food sovereignty. If you're a producer of beef or pork, it takes a long time to raise your animals to slaughter weight, and you often have to predict demand months or years even ahead of time. This leaves you vulnerable to supply chain and other disruptions. With alternative proteins, though, you can produce the same food in weeks or months. Feedback loops are shortened dramatically, which reduces supply volatility. And we're also able to co-locate production facilities anywhere in the world. You can produce protein in or near cities, or produce fresh seafood inland, far away from oceans. And for my concluding slide, I just wanted to stress that central to the concept of alternative proteins is the idea that meat doesn't have to be from an animal and dairy doesn't have to be from a cow. These next generation companies are breaking meat down into its component parts and recreating each component in a better way. This is part of a major shift towards reframing protein away from meat and towards a broader category of protein. Over the past several years, this is not new. Meat itself has been abstracted away from the animal. In our urbanized worlds, we've moved away from having a farm or buying whole cuts of beef or parts of an animal. Instead, we go to the grocery store and we buy very carefully packaged cuts and formats of meat. This has been enabled by other food technology innovations such as cold shipping. But it also means that meat is less about being a hunk of animal-based tissue, and it's more about its functional and experiential attributes. Protein is being spread across the plate and can take various forms. And now we have many opportunities ahead to make protein in a better way. There's an incredible amount of innovation that is possible. We have a whole world yet of untapped plants, algae, and fungi to explore, and different combinations of proteins to try. However, I do want to stress that to fully capture the potential of alternative proteins, it will be critical to market for flavor, experience, quality, and price. And with that, thank you so much for your time today. To learn more, please feel free to contact me. My email is right here, audreyg@gfi.org. Or please feel free to check out our wealth of resources available online at gfi.org. And at this point, I'm not sure if we have a lot of time, but I'd be happy to take any questions if we do.
For starters, thanks for taking the time yourself and presenting so much about the company and the insights that you're also following. So the first question would actually be regarding the last thing you were mentioning. So would this presentation be recorded and sent over potentially and shared to the audience? Is that something you're okay with?
I'd be more than happy to do that. Can I send that to you?
Definitely. And then it will be us sharing on. So thank you for that. And then one quick question, as we are a little bit short with time, is as you're commenting on all the different types of, let's say, innovation, so cultivated, fermented, and plant-based, in general, where do you see corporates moving faster in terms of what's actually mostly on the startup side, and where are corporates starting to enter and trying to take the lead?
Yeah, I mean, I think they are getting involved at all stages and all of the production pillars. That being said, plant-based is the most advanced of these right now. Although fermentation is there, it's just hidden a little bit. So I would say plant-based leads the way. Nine out of the top 10 meat companies have started or collaborated on a plant-based line in the last few years. However, we are seeing increasing interest in cultivated meat, specifically from venture arms of different and strategic arms of different corporations.
And another quick question there regarding the fermentation side. So considering, let's say, fermentation for the cheese products, do you see startups are mostly moving on the B2C side, or are there already some which are considering also the B2B way? Or is that kind of like, first I go to the market with my own brand and then I demonstrate how good I am and I move on to the ingredient?
I think it's all of the above. Absolutely. Perfect Day, they launched their first ice cream that was direct to consumer, but I feel like they are making more of a B2B long-term play. Clara Foods is another exciting company in this space, making different egg proteins and other proteins. And they right now are very focused on B2B because that's just a huge market opportunity.
Agreed. So thanks again, Audrey. Thanks for also mentioning your contacts and your reference points to get back to you. And yeah, thanks again for taking the time to be here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right. To everybody, thank you and bye-bye.